A Croft in the Hills by Katharine Stewart.
Chapter 7. The Piglets Arrive. By the end of April, the place was swarming with young things. Hope's calf was let out of the byre and went charging round the field like some fantastic clockwork creature. Home-hatched ducklings were weaving through the rushes in a long golden line. Tiny yellow balls of chickens were scattered over the short, bright grass. Lambs, startlingly white, as though freshly laundered in a favored brand of detergent, were bouncing about in the heather and making wild dashes across the fields. Then the goat made a contribution to this nursery world in the shape of a tiny brown kid. It was the most fascinating baby creature of them all. Fawn-like, yet quite fearless, with bright, intelligent eyes, it would stand poised on a pinnacle of stone, gazing quizzically at everything, then suddenly leap and cavort in the air for the sheer joy of using its limbs. Helen would watch its antics for hours on end, completely under its spell. Meanwhile, we had, thanks to our banker, added a further 20 gimmers to our sheep stock and put a fresh batch of 5-week-old poults in the rearing houses. We certainly had our hands full, but it was a real delight to be working among all these young things. We didn't find the long hours a burden. I think the spring air, the fresh, plain food, and the deep, trance-like sleep we fell into at night kept us going. This sort of life generates its own energy. It imposes its rhythm, and if you respond to it, you can keep up a steady pace. There is none of the rushing and jolting, interspersed with blank spaces of boredom which waste so much vital force in an artificial way of living. It has its own routine, of course, but within that routine there is always something fresh cropping up to hold the interest and to challenge intuitive powers. One is conscious of keeping all the facilities in trim. Brain, brawn, imagination, and understanding are all constantly in play. One is on one's toes, yet relaxed. There was now only one thing needed to complete our happiness: a pig. Could we woo the banker to the point of allowing our overdraft the generosity to embrace one little porker, we wondered. It appeared we could. Anyhow, Jim went to Dingwall Market one beautiful May morning and came home with not one pig but 4 small, squirming bundles of sacking in the back of the van and a triumphant twinkle in his eye. As we loosed each bundle, its contents turned out to be a plump, dapper little porker, which scampered round the pen, then stood 4 square in front of us on its neat pink trotters, looking at us out of unwinking eyes, brashly demanding sustenance. We had to like the little beggars. They were impudent yet fetching, and they grew at an alarming rate. We had skim milk for them, and potatoes to which we added protein, and they found a lot of nourishment in the ground itself. In fact, we had always wanted a pig or two, not only because the market was good and they could give a quick return, but also because of their value as cultivators. Jim had fixed up a shelter for them from sheets of corrugated iron lined with straw encased in wire netting. This he had placed in an enclosure on a piece of rough ground full of couch grass and heather. The whole thing, shelter and enclosure, was movable. Our idea was for them to bulldoze and fertilize bit by bit this piece of ground, which could then provide first-class grazing for sheep and cattle. The piglets soon got the idea, and the morning after their arrival their little pink snouts were black with burrowing in the peaty soil. Whatever it was in the way of vitamins and minerals they got out of the heather roots and the ground, I don't know, but they certainly did thrive. There was no lolling about in a clean concrete sty for them. They worked for their living, and they liked it. The exercise in the confined space certainly didn't prevent them putting on good, healthy flesh. Neighbors came from far and wide to cast an eye over them, prod them with sticks, scratch their backs, and murmur "porky, porky" into their appreciative ears. A pig does love to be flattered, and the neighbors would say, as they lit their pipes and shook their heads slowly from side to side, grandpigs, in a ruminative, almost wistful way. In the old days, when weaners were to be had for half a crown, every croft had its pig, tenderly reared in a small dark stay. In November it would be stuck and salted. Mrs. McLean had given me the recipe for the brine mixture and told me tales of the great feastings they had always had with the Christmas ham. However, these particular pigs were to go to market, and go they did a couple of months later, when they fetched more than double their purchase price, and we bought 6 more with the proceeds. That month, we had a real heat wave. Warm, dry weather is so much the exception to the rule here that we tend to welcome it with open arms and to revel in it unthinkingly. The heat shimmers over the moor, the hills are shrouded in blue haze, the scent of the small flowers is honey-sweet and lulling. Helen scampers around in the briefest of sunsuits, and in no time at all is burned gypsy brown, but a heat wave brings its problems. We hadn't had much snow that winter. The springs were running low, and to our dismay we found that there was not enough of a flow to drive the pump at the well. The storage tank in the house was empty, and we began a frantic search for an additional supply. We wished the golden well were not so far away. It would have solved all our problems. Neighbors, sympathetic as always to our troubles, told us of several spots where they remembered water rising long ago. We followed the directions and eventually came on an old horse well, where our predecessors had always watered the horses. It looked promising. Jim and Billy cleared the rushes, dug down to the source of it, and laid a pipe to connect the flow with that from our existing source. It was not strong enough to make much difference immediately, but we were confident that it would help after a good spell of rain. In the meantime, we had to carry water for drinking and cooking in pails every morning and evening, while for washing we still had some in the big butt at the back door. When that was done, I carried the clothes down to the near burn and laundered them there. It was very pleasant on a burning hot day. I would lie the linen on the flat stone and rub it clean, then rinse it in the clear flow. Now and again an astonished trout would flash through the washing pool. A frog would give me an incredulous stare before bounding to the safety of a cool green hollow in the bank. When my back began to ache, I would stretch out in the grass and watch Helen splashing in her own pool upstream. Dinner would be a picnic eaten on the doorstep that day, and I would make up for it by producing ham omelet and a cool salad at supper time. I am thankful that eggs agree with us all and that they can be made into an almost endless variety of dishes. An egg and a lettuce, bread, butter, and milk, I think we could all live on those forever. One evening, after a blazing day which had left us really limp, we noticed the sky clouding at sunset. Helen was asleep upstairs. The chickens and ducklings had all gone to roost. Everything was very still and quiet, and we were sitting in the cool of the living room looking through the papers when I felt my ears twitch. I listened intently. It was a sound we had been waiting weeks to hear, the patter of rain on the tin roof of the scullery. We jumped up and looked out. The branches of the rowans were stirring, a breeze was rising, and the rain was hissing on the parched ground. I think no sailor on a waterless raft in the mid-Pacific ever greeted a thunder plump as deliriously as we did. In a remarkably short time, the water butt was overflowing. As we couldn't bear to see this water going to waste, I struggled into gumboots, mackintosh, and sou'wester, and put every available pail, basin, and bath in turn under the overflow spout. Jim quickly bored a hole in the scullery window frame, inserted a length of rubber tubing in the top of the butt, passed it through the hole and into the sink. To see the sink filling with this lovely, soft rainwater sent me nearly crazy with delight. We rushed in and out carrying pails till we were soaked to the skin, our eyes bright in our gleaming faces. The supply of water we accumulated that night lasted us until the weather resumed its normal dampness. We had a really grand crop of potatoes that year, at the cost of a deal of labor and anxiety. The field they were in had borne such an exceptional heavy growth of corn the year before that the weeds had been well smothered. It had been plowed each day in the spring so that the tilth was as fine as one could wish. We had borrowed a ridge plow to open the drills. The planting had been heavy work, but with 3.5 of us on the job, we had managed it fairly quickly. Then came the closing of the drills, a tricky operation with a tractor. The implement being in one's rear, it is the easiest thing in the world to knock the tubers out of place when covering them, with the result that they are liable to come up unevenly spaced or through the side of the drills or even in the spaces between the drills. Many people prefer to use a horse plow to close the drills, as by this method you can see exactly where you are and have greater control of your implement. However, Jim was determined to use the tractor, and at bottom we applauded his courage, but our hearts were in our mouth as we watched the great shining blades scatter the nicely placed tubers in all directions. After completing the first few drills, Jim got into the way of the work, and the crop certainly seemed to be covered. Next day we went up and down the field with hoes, pushing an odd tuber here and there into place. Then other things claimed our attention. We had to leave the potatoes to their fate. Soon we began to cast an anxious eye over the field. Sure enough, the dark green crinkled shoots were coming through the ground in the most unexpected places. The field, which had hitherto had the beautiful symmetry of a chessboard, now began to look like something that had come out in a rash. We refused to be dismayed. Each armed with a hoe, we worked up and down the field, pushing and scraping until we had virtually transformed each drill into a space, and vice versa. The effect was slightly irregular, of course, but when the plants came to maturity, the leafiness of them hid the waywardness of their ranks, and they were a noble sight. The heavy hoeing had killed every would-be weed at birth, and the potatoes had it all their own way throughout the summer. The turnips, too, were good that year, though by the time we finished singling them, we felt we'd been born with a hoe in our hands. Smack pole, we went, day after day, along the interminable drills. We saw a turnip seedling sprouting in our dreams, and wished the cows were not so desperately fond of the things. It was only the thought of being able to dump a pailful of succulent slivers under the nose of a stalled beast on a winter morning that kept us going. A turnip is indeed a handy thing to have about the place in winter. It gives a savor to the family soup pot. The hens love to peck away at one when the smugness of their deep litter houses begins to pale, and they're longing for a little diversion, and the sheep will gladly polish off any still left in the field in the hunger gap of early spring. We managed to keep the garden fairly clear of marauders that summer, though every time I went up to get a lettuce or an apronful of peas, I dreaded what I might find in the way of damage done overnight. The black-faced sheep has all the instincts of a mountaineer and is quite able to scale or barge through an ordinary wire fence. Cows have elastic necks with an amazing reach and a distinct fondness for flower heads of all kinds. Anything growing on the other side of a fence has an irresistible attraction for them. I sometimes wonder what they secretly made of the taste of the luscious-looking nasturtium leaves they devoured. Then there were all the other garden enemies, the goat, rabbits, and moles and hares. Even the chickens were most unhelpful in the early part of the season, when they were on free range. They would fly over the fence and scratch up the new-sown seed in a kind of demented frenzy. One morning I found Charlie the horse standing with a rather shamefaced, bewildered look in his eye in the midst of the trampled cabbages. It transpired that the children had left the gate open the evening before. Charlie had wandered in, and the gate had blown in, and he couldn't get out again. It was surprising, really, the small amount of damage he had actually done. I think he'd had a conscience about it. Anyhow, he seemed glad enough to be released from his enforced captivity among the vegetables. It was a minor miracle that even one carrot survived in the face of all these hazards. Our appreciation of the perilous journey which each bit of green stuff or root had endured before it reached the dish gave an added savor to our meals. All in all, that was a good year for the garden. The currant bushes which a neighbor had given us began to bear fruit. Mint, parsley, and chives were all flourishing, along with carrots, parsnips, radishes, peas, beans, chicory, beetroot, spinach, and all the usual greens. There were even a few knobbly cauliflowers. In his few spare moments, Jim had made a glass house on a frame of scrap picked up at Inverness yard. I had high hopes of producing tomatoes in this, and I did put a dozen plants in a homemade compost in margarine boxes. But they took too long to ripen in the meager heat and only developed some rather tight, pale balls of fruit which I made into chutney. However, I found the glass house an excellent place for bringing on flower seedlings, and sequentially it was put to other uses. It served as a brooder house for day-old chicks, and at once saved the lives of some weakly piglets. One year it grew a vegetable marrow, and now produces strawberries and mushrooms, and gives us some most welcome out-of-season lettuce. It has done much to add spice to our lives, and has become quite a landmark. Sun and moonlight glisten on its roof, making it wink cheerfully across this landscape. In a small enclosure off the garden, Jim had placed our much-traveled beehives, and he liked to talk bees with anyone who was interested. Every croft has its hive or two, but there were no real enthusiasts in the district. However, word soon got round that Jim was bee-minded, and he'd travel miles to collect swarms. The real bee-man is born, not made. Either you have a feeling for the little creatures or you haven't. Jim undoubtedly has. He works away quite unconcerned among them, scorning hats, veils, and other protective apparatus. There is only a short clover season here, but the heather is on the bees' doorstep, and they were soon reveling in it and laying up another small harvest for us. Our cattle all passed another tuberculin test, but Hope suddenly became alarmingly ill. On entering the byre one morning for the milking, she lay down in her stall and refused to move. Her stomach was swollen like a balloon, and she was groaning in a most distressing way. We thought she had probably overeaten herself in the lush summer grass and was blown. If that were the case, the only remedy we knew was the drastic one of plunging a sharp instrument into her side to release the accumulation of gases, and we knew it had to be done at once if she was to be saved. We looked at one another, wondering who would have the courage to perform the operation. Then, by great luck, we happened to notice the vet's car drawing up at Willie McLean's. He was on his testing round. Billy was dispatched with an urgent message, and within a quarter of an hour the vet was examining Hope. She was not, he said, blown. The swelling apparently was in the wrong place for that. With a mighty combined effort, we got her to her feet, and he gave her a drench and told us to keep her in the byre with her forelegs higher than her rear. We obeyed instructions, and she slowly recovered, but she had very little milk for some time after that. We were thankful disaster had been averted. The loss of a cow in a small place such as ours can be a very serious matter indeed. The result of this mysterious affliction was that Hope failed to come into season at the appropriate time. It is important on a bleak hill farm to have the calves born about April or May so that the cow and calf get the benefit of the good weather. To this end, the cows must be serviced in earlier midsummer. With some beasts, you can detect at once the restlessness, which means they are, in local parlance, wanting away. Immediately you sling on the rope halter and allow yourself to be dragged the uphill mile to the bull's domain. If you're lucky, the one trip will suffice. If not, you may have to accompany the wayward lady twice or even thrice on her nuptial journey. With other beasts, it is sometimes extremely difficult to detect the signs. They may occur only at night when the household is asleep. You're lucky then if a kindly farmer will allow your cow or heifer to run with his bull for a lengthy period to ensure satisfaction. That summer, Hope had not the slightest desire to gallivant. In the end, in desperation, we had to get the vet to give her an injection, which had the desired effect of making her head post-haste bullwards. We have since spent many anxious hours trying to anticipate the moods of various members of our small herd, and have often wished that artificial insemination were not such a skilled and costly business. On the rare occasion when we had leisure to lean on a gate, in those early summer days, we couldn't help feeling a certain sense of achievement. The cattle and sheep were thriving, the pigs were rootling and putting on weight. The lambs were all safely inoculated and bid fair to become winners. The hens and ducks were still laying hard, and the new pullets were making good progress. They were white leghorn crossed with light Sussex, and as trim and elegant as ballerinas. The potato and turnip crops were lush and green. There was a ripple through the young grass, and the oats were showing a milky sheen. There was much to consolidate, much to improve, but we felt we had at least passed a couple of milestones on our road.